Thank you, everyone, and thank you, Ashish, Shriya, and Lobo, for agreeing to do this. This is my first time moderating a session, so I'm very happy that I have no reason to worry. A lot of the talking, as I've been told earlier also, is going to be done by the three of them. Um, so, welcome everyone. This is the first sort of panel that we're doing for the day, and there's a lot that Deepa has left us with to reflect on. Um, like Vrinda said, this is a session that talks about the takeaways, the insights, and the lessons that we have had from the philanthropic ecosystem over the past few years. Um, we know that India is a fast growing economy. It's on a very healthy growth trajectory. It has a robust growth rate of around 8.7% in FY22. Economists are placing the growth rate for 23 at around 7%. And the middle class in India has been growing steadily, and the nation is striving to become a whopping $5 trillion economy by FY 2025. Despite all of this ambition to be a national, or all this ambition of national and economic progress, and also being on the right trajectory for it, there are many systemic inequalities that continue to persist, a glimpse of which Deepa gave us in her last session. How can we address these inequalities as we go forward? One of the answers to that is public spending, right? And public spending has grown by 35% in FY22. What we are here today to talk about is what philanthropy can do, what private spending can do, because even today, public spending carries the weight of about 95% of the capital that goes into the development sector. And therefore, today at this session, I would like to invite all of our speakers to help us think about the future of giving to India while reflecting on everything that we have been doing right and have been doing wrong in the ecosystem so far. For starters, I think, Lobo, I would like to start with you. We were talking about this before, and even a couple of months ago when I got a chance to speak with you, that you occupy a unique position in the kind of stakeholders that exist in the civil society. Lobo runs the Chintu Gudia Foundation, through which he is a donor, he's a funder, and you also run Tech for Dev, through which you're a grantee. Given your experience of seeing both sides of the coin, can you talk to us a little bit about what sort of gaps exist in the giving ecosystem right now?
So I'll just rephrase the question, right? And I'll answer the question as to my perspectives as a person from both the funder side. Oh, sorry, you can't hear me? Is this on? Yeah, you can just. Okay, yeah. Can you hear me now? Oh, great. So I'll just give you my perspectives as both as a funder and a fundee, and my expectations from both, right? So before I really go into it, I'll say that as someone seeking funds from foundations, I think I'm in a slightly better position than most people, primarily because I can go in with a lot of confidence, and to a large extent, they treat me as peers. So to some extent, it's my experience is very, it's very skewed, right? That's the bottom line, but I think it still gives a slightly nuanced version of it. Again, I look at it from a funder perspective and how I've grown into it over the past 20 years and the ups and downs. And they will probably tell you a lot more stories about this, but for the first 10 to 12 or maybe even 15 years, I really wasn't very involved in the Indian funder ecosystem. And luckily for me, I met Deval and Neera a long time ago before we started on the journey. And I realized that, hey, if we aren't going to do too much with the Indian NGO ecosystem on a personal basis, we might as well trust someone to actually do it for us and to do a much better job for us out there. And so for the first 10, 12, 15 years, Deval and Neera and the Dasra team actually handled pretty much all of our India giving. Right? And it would be like, we'd probably have a couple of hours conversation with them and they would do it. So for many of the donors and funders in the room, right, I would say that if you're not willing to invest, and many of us don't have the time, right? So you don't necessarily have to give your time, but if you understand and accept the fact that you don't have the time, and maybe you're not very interested in it either, right? It's okay, all of us may not be interested in the sector. It's okay to delegate. It's okay to kind of give a third party, like in this case for me it was Dasra, the responsibility and tell them like, here's the approximate guidelines. Now, looking back, I'll also tell you one of the big mistakes I made, right? Or I wouldn't say mistakes, but just learnings. As with many immigrants and with many people from my generation, and I see this in many new donors also, right? You always think that, hey, education is what got me out of. Education basically helped bump my income quartile from a low level to a slightly high level. Hence, we want to hence we want to donate to education, help the education system, etc. Totally valid cause, great cause, definitely do it. But if I had to go back 15 years ago, right, or 18 years ago, I would probably spend more time learning about other sectors in the ecosystem. So the advice that I offer many donors today is like, lots of NGOs come in through the Bay Area. Like, it's totally worth it, irrespective of whether you want to fund them or not. Just go spend 1 hour with them, learn from them, understand what they're doing, and you'll just broaden your scope a lot more. Right? So that kind of gives you a better understanding of who's doing what the sector is trying to do, etc. We've met many, many NGOs over the past 20 years, but the thing that has probably helped me the most, again, from a funder perspective, is when our kids were growing up, we really wanted to volunteer with our kids in India, right? It took me and we wanted to do this since they were 6 years old, but it took me like 3 or 4 years to figure out an NGO in India who would be willing to take us as a family, etc. And again, they will kind of gave me the referral with 17,000 feet in Ladakh. And then for the next 5 years, I think we basically spent 2 to 3 weeks every summer volunteering with our kids, and because our kids would hate us if they only had to deal with us. So we always would manage to convince another family with kids their age to come with us and share the experience. So the kids could complain and whine about how their parents separately but those experience means, I think that's where I learned the most about the sector, right? When I would spend 2 to 3 weeks, obviously disconnected from, in Ladakh we didn't actually have mobiles and anything, there was no internet connectivity out there, but that I think raised my level of understanding and empathy. When I say raised, the bar is really low, it went slightly above the low bar, right? I don't think we'll ever come into I don't think I'll ever understand what Deepa said, right? Means I think I might appreciate it and everything, and we'll try to come close to walking in her shoes, but we'll never ever be in her shoes. And just getting that understanding and figuring that out, I think was probably my biggest takeaway as a funder, right? Now, switching to the other side, as a grantee, here's the things that if a funder tells me like, hey, what do you want me, how can I help you? The first thing I tell them is like, the best thing is just give me a check and then go away, right? I'll give you quarterly reports, right? I'll tell you exactly what I'm doing. If you're going to ask me questions, means I love, if you want to engage with me, if you want to ask me questions and everything, I'm more than happy to answer all of your questions, right? You can ask me as many questions as you want. You can make suggestions. But if you make a suggestion, right, be willing and be humble enough is too strong a word, but have the conviction to realize that you might not know as much as either the NGOs or even some of us have the experience, but be willing to listen and understand and appreciate what we are doing and why we are doing it. And be willing to push us. So just as an example, right, over the past year, we've been working with this grant of an amazing funder-fundee relationship, right? We've been working with Omidyar Network India for a fairly large grant, right? And it's actually taken us over a year. But, and they've pushed us really, really hard. But I would say like 95% of what they wanted us to do was the things that we should have been doing or we would be doing in the next 3 years, right? So even though the amount of work we've had to do for that grant, right, from a paperwork perspective, from a bureaucratic perspective, was insane. But I probably agreed with most of what they wanted us to do. And in the few cases where I disagreed, right, I was willing to talk to them, means I could push back to them, and they would listen and they would come back and compromise. Right? So I think having that open channel of communication and being generous with your time with your grantee, listening to them, listening to what they need is important, right? Means I could go on and on about unrestricted funding and everything. The main problem which I have with that is Many times we'll give unrestricted funds to our grantees, right? And we'll tell them, like, hey, spend it on what you think is right because we trust you. But over the past few years, I've actually changed my model on that, right? So these days, it's still unrestricted, but I also tell them, like, if you want to spend on your staff, if you want to increase salaries, if you want to give, like, make your employees happier, etc., spend it on that. I encourage you to spend it on that before, like, putting it on programs, right? If you want to put it on programs, great. But do think about making life for your staff and for yourself a lot better. Right? Primarily because I realized that many NGOs would always feel that I cannot ask for this, right? This is not something I can ask for, right? So I figured, like, hey, just getting this upfront in the conversation and telling them, spend it on you and your staff is like, I'm not putting a restriction on the funds, but I'm giving you an option to do it, like that you might be a bit scared to raise it with me. And yeah, means don't make them do too much reports. Means we make them do reports, but we tell them do it in your own style. Send us an email, but do it once every quarter. But means make everything flexible. Listen to what they want. Like, don't set your own priorities on them. Let them tell you what their priorities are and make them accountable to their priorities, right? Not to your priorities. So I could go on and on, but I'll stop there.
No, thank you so much, Lobo. And the point that you made, there's obviously a lot of takeaways for the kind of giving that a lot of us here in the room are doing. But you brought up an interesting point about how sometimes, despite having access to unrestricted funding, NGOs continue to do things in the hardwired way. And we were talking with Deepa and Deep earlier this week, where they said that we need vehicles that give us unrestricted funding, that give us space to discover and teach us to dream again. Because they started organizations with excellent objectives and excellent missions, but somewhere along the way, with the kind of support that they have gotten or with the kind of ecosystem that we've all together created, they have just been hardwired to think that the programs are the only things that they need to do. So this came from obviously our conversations with the NGO leaders here, but that's a great segue to you, Ria, actually, because I know that you are on your own sort of journey of speaking to a lot of NGO leaders, understanding from them what they need. And it will be great for us to hear from you what are some of your lessons that have come up from these conversations. And also Lobo spoke of how he's volunteered with his kids at an NGO. You've also had a very rich legacy that you received from your mother. We were speaking about it earlier. And it'll be great to hear a little bit about how you've taken lessons from that, as well as things that you've learned on your own from your conversations with NGO leaders, and how that's sort of shaping the way you are thinking about giving.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for having me here. It's really a pleasure, and I'm sort of bewildered about why I'm on this panel, but with these two, but thank you regardless. No, as Shreya said, I'm very lucky. I've grown up in a family where there's been a very strong and rich legacy of philanthropy and giving. My mother's done a lot of work with Dasra over the last decade or so. And so it was easy and generous to kind of fall into the spaces that she created for me. But I just really resonate so much with what Lobo said. If I wasn't holding this mic, I'd have been clapping. I think that, so, even this point about education, that's another example of us putting our perspective of what we think matters on the development space. Whereas I think really what I've learned so much from talking to NGO leaders is they live in these communities, they know these worlds, they know them better than we ever will. When Deepa talks about vulnerability, she's using that word in a way that we will not fully understand in the way that she understands. And so what I found is the best thing to do, really, is to just give that space, right? And to trust and to say, you know what your community needs. I'm not going to tell you that it's education and career development, because those were things that were helpful for me in my development journey. Maybe for your community, what they need are some things that are totally different. And maybe there's some aspects of that that will come into it. And so what I found is building, one thing that my mom and I have talked a lot about is around building sector resilience. And where we think our role as donors in that can be is to say, how do we create space for innovation and pilots? So for example, yes, the founders are very heads down in program design. But if we give unrestricted funding to pick up on that, can we then encourage them to take risks and try something out that others would not fund? Others would say, this is unproven, so we won't give you funding for this. We'll say, let's go for it. Let's test it out as a pilot. Maybe ways that we can contribute is in collaborations, opening doors to other organizations through whom they can partner and spread the work that they're doing. Maybe it's through leadership development, right? So maybe it's for the frontline people within the organization to grow themselves. Maybe it's through technology integration, which I hope that Lobo talks about a little bit later. And then really, maybe it's about encouraging the people who are doing this work that we all agree is so incredibly important to take care of themselves and to think about what does well-being mean for themselves, for their teams, and how do we make sure that this work continues, because it's a marathon and we hope that they'll be doing this quality of work for many decades to come. And they need support as human beings to do that. So I think, I don't know if that answers your question, Shreya, but maybe we can start with that.
Yeah, no, that does. It's always very nice to hear about how someone who has started or is on their own giving journey is understanding what they're hearing from the sector, from the people within it. And you brought up a really good point about collaboration. It's something that all of us realized is extremely crucial during COVID. I mean, when nobody was able to do much, grassroots organizations and community-based organizations were rallying support amongst themselves on the ground and helping communities because we couldn't go to the communities, right? So it's definitely a very important point that you brought up. And I was thinking also of, and this brings me to you, Ashish, collaboration within similar stakeholder groups is obviously the key, but you are someone who's had rich experience in working with the diaspora giving community here. We recognize at Dasra, and I think generally, that the diaspora giving community needs to continue to do what it does, but the Indian philanthropic community is also already stepping up, and it should continue to do so. What can you sort of, maybe, if this is the right question to ask, but what can you tell us about how can these two giving groups collaborate with each other? And it doesn't mean a union of sorts or like coming together to one forum, but there might be areas that, let's say, the Indian giving community can step up on more, or various ways to collaborate. So if you can talk to us about that.
Yeah, thanks, Shreya, and it's great to be here. I can give a couple of examples of from the diaspora context as to how a couple of first-generation communities or categories, how they can provide an example of how this might play out in India. So the two categories, the category one is the people who moved in the 80s and 90s. These people spent the 80s and 90s accumulating wealth, becoming successful, bringing their families over. So the first couple of decades were really focused on that. And so while philanthropy was on the to-do list, it was not a top priority. Now the same group has accumulated the wealth. They are looking to give back, they're looking to engage. They're thinking about philanthropy in a very strategic way. And they are reprioritizing their lives, and they want to give, and that's the focus of their lives. So in terms of philanthropy to India, I think activating that community is okay. We are doing well. There is this other community, the other category of first-generation Indians who are in their 30s and 40s, and they are accumulating wealth at a massively fast pace, through work, through entrepreneurship, through an equity event. They also want to give, but they are not at a stage of life where they have the time. And it has been a real challenge to engage this community. They are all people who want to engage, but we've not successfully found pathways to engage with that community. And I think we need to do that because the giving from that community is ad hoc. It is not very consistent. And so moving that to the India context, I think stage of life is important. I think people at a certain stage of life will reprioritize and will give. And I think the first category or the first community of people are easier, no, targets is the wrong word, but the easier community to really, for us to create pathways for them to take big bets. I think the other piece is also wealth crystallization, and I think it takes time. wealth is crystallized. People want to make sure that they are safe, their families are safe, and there has to be a certain passage of time before that community starts giving. So I think if we can simultaneously do something for the people who are accumulating wealth much faster, it will be awesome in the India context, because that is what we've learned here, that it's been a real challenge. We are stepping up. We are trying to do things. We are trying to go to them because they are not coming to us, because they don't have the time. So I think that would really help in the India context.
No, thank you so much. And Ashish, this is amazing because you keep saying things that help me segue to the next question. So you spoke about how givers essentially fit into different categories. Stage of life is so important. And I really wanted to ask Ria, because even in the India Philanthropy Report, I know that we've spoken about some of the funders that we engage with, including yourself, as next gen, intergen, new gen givers. And therefore, with all the titles that have been attached, there's a certain amount of pressure and responsibility to really do things differently. While you might or might not want to do things differently as people expect you to, can you talk to us about maybe a couple of things that you are very excited about as someone who has the ability to shape, to some extent, the future of giving to India, or how things will happen in the years to come?
Yeah, thank you. So I've been, again, I've been lucky that, so my mom has, done a lot of work in philanthropy over the last few decades, and recently she said, look, I want to be more strategic about my personal philanthropy, and so we decided that we would spend, over the last couple of years, really engaging with Dasra and saying, let's really craft what her personal philanthropy looks like. And that was a great opportunity for me also to work with her and really get a sense of what's important to her in terms of her giving. It's a deeply personal conversation. We all give for different reasons. We're motivated to do things for different reasons. So it really helped me also understand a lot about her motivations. And what I realized is that actually, Shreya, I don't think we need to do things that differently. I think a lot of the values, at least maybe I was lucky, they're there. And there are decades of experience in philanthropy that we don't need to throw away. What we do need to do is to push for things that maybe some philanthropists were already doing, but others maybe need to do more of. So having a gender equity, diversity, and inclusion lens is something that we decided to really bring into our work. We said we want to really focus on the most underserved causes and communities, and that's where we want our resources to go. We said that we want to work with proximate leaders because we've actually heard a lot of those conversations here in this space around Black Lives Matter and feminism and so on, but we don't hear it as much in the Indian context. And we should think about supporting proximate leaders in that context as well. Well-being were things that we brought into our sort of giving lens as well. So I don't think that these were things that I'm bringing in as a new gen. I think that this is just vocabulary. Mental health is a great one. I think before there was a focus on mental health, but it perhaps wasn't spoken of in the same way. And so I think that where we can make a difference, and what I'm really excited to see, is that we have language around all of this now. And so we can push for that. We can learn from global communities and how they have made change happen. And we can think about what that translates to in an Indian context. I think that's really powerful. And so we don't need to throw things away. We just need to reshape the language a little bit.
Can I make just one point? I was just reading a statistic recently that in 1980 or in the 80s, there was just 2% of the second and third gen or next gen diaspora in the US. Now it is 35%, and so it is going to continue to grow. And what Ria just mentioned, the risk-taking ability, it has truly the ability to change, bring a different dimension in how things are funded, what is being funded, and how the entire ecosystem is funded. And I think if we have to succeed, we have to address, we have to make sure that we are providing these pathways, because that percentage is only going to increase in the US.
Thank you so much, Ashish and Ria. So this is the last question that I have for the panel, and then we'll open up for Q&A. so that we have some time to do that. But quickly before we go on, Ria mentioned that there are things that we are already doing that we need to develop language around it so that it can be contextualized essentially to different geographies. Um, while that was like my previous question was about new gen. One question for you that I have is there's a lot of not new but new-ish conversation that's going on in the Indian civil society about how tech needs to really come in. Funders are pushing for NGOs to invest in tech, and that it's being touted as not a solution as such, but a massive enabler. With Tech for Dev, you do a lot of this work. We've had interesting conversations in the past about this. So can you please just share a little of your viewpoint around that?
Yeah, sure. And this again comes down to what I think funders should and shouldn't do, right? And so we are running Tech for Dev, and we are working with quite a few foundations across India. And my least favorite way of engaging with NGOs in this is when a funder tells us to work with a few NGOs, and we push back heavily against it, because whether we like it or not, right? And it is, and even with me, right? Though I try to minimize the power dynamic, there is always a power dynamic between the funder and the fundee. And if a funder says like, hey, why don't you look into this, right? For the fundee, it is like, I better basically put my best person on this thing because this might lead to a lot more money. It might lead to a lot more engagement. It might lead to a next grant, right? If I don't do anything with this, I'm going to get asked about it, and and conversations will die on that, right? So that's why it's my least preferred method. And we keep telling the foundations, like, let the NGO decide. If tech is a priority for NGOs, let them, or irrespective of what let them make the priority list, and then you can support them in executing their priority list. I just had a conversation with one of India's largest, and at least to me, like Dream a Dream Foundation, Vishal and Suchita, and for the funders in the room who haven't met them, right? To me, they are the power couple and extremely inspiring individuals. And that's where I met Sonal also at the last Change the Script conference. And when we are having this conversation with Suchita, right, my view on tech is like they've been running this large multi-million-dollar organization without significant tech. And my conversation with her was, you really don't need tech, right? You've got to decide if you want to put tech in your programs. Like if you decide you want tech in your programs, and if you're convinced, then we can help you. But we don't feel that tech is needed in everything and everywhere. But I do think it's important for us to allow the staff at NGOs, the people running the organization, to make that decision. Because unless they are driving it, unless they are pushing it because of their belief, it's not going to work. And hence, again, like I think funders should advise, funders should nudge, and then funders should back away. Right? Means beyond that, so again, like while I do love tech and everything, but I don't think it's a universal solution. It's just an enabler. It's going to allow NGOs to do a lot of good things, but it's not necessarily the thing that every NGO should just get started on right away.
Can I build on that? I think it's important to say this also because we're sitting in Silicon Valley, that innovation and tech are two different things. And we need to think about innovation in the context that these organizations are working in, right? So innovation does not always mean a mobile app. Innovation does not mean a WhatsApp API. I'm laughing because we have an NGO founder who I really like in the front row saying, thank you, as I say that. But I think, we should really think innovation means doing something different and taking a risk in a bootstrapped context. And that can mean a different and innovative kind of program design. It can mean a community intervention at Anubhuti Trust that teaches youth about constitutional rights. We've worked with Sadbhavna that works with women and girls in Lucknow to give them a sense of agency. And the way one of their interventions is through filmmaking. So they help women and girls make documentaries to tell the stories of their lives. That's innovation. What Sonal is doing with Protsahan and using art in a really interesting way to heal childhood trauma, that's innovation. So I think it's important also for us to decouple innovation and tech. Sometimes tech can be the right answer, and sometimes innovation looks entirely different.
So just again, sorry, building up on your building up, right? So means to me what innovation is giving them the time, money, flexibility, and advice for experimentation, right? So we encourage all our NGOs, right? Like experiment, like try to prove your model, try to get some sense of data or some sense of gut feel as to why what you're doing is going to work, right? Change the model, like don't go down the same path all the time, right? And you don't necessarily need tech, like the way you go on different paths could be one of many different things that we are mentioned. So give them the money to be flexible and try to experiment and fail, right? Failure is not a big deal. Like within Tech for Dev, we've had projects which we've just scrapped because like, hey, we don't think we are the right people for this at the right point in time. We'll continue doing our pilots. Maybe it will succeed, maybe it won't.
Thank you so much. um, I'll quickly go into Q&A now. We might have some time. But before that, I think my most key takeaway from our discussion today is that no matter how much we want to believe, a power dynamic exists. As funders, we just need to be conscious of it. As NGOs, we need to build the ability to challenge it, to question it, and to hold our own. And as an ecosystem around NGOs, it's everyone's responsibility to enable them to do that. So I think, thank you so much for leaving me with that takeaway. And I'll open up for Q&A now. And we have mic runners around the room. Yep.
Thank you. It's Alex Counts from the India Philanthropy Alliance. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I find in philanthropy there's a lot of ageism. That we say to young people, wait your turn until you've accumulated wealth, had family, sent them to college, kids, et cetera. And so I'm wondering, you talked about second and third gen, next gen. What are some effective ways to engage youth in philanthropy focused on India? At the Alliance, we've launched a national essay competition on philanthropy in India, and it's in its 4th year. And thank you, Ashish, for being supportive from Give. But what are the success models out there? What works?
I think it just depends, Alex. I think it depends on, for second and third gen, it depends how close their ties are with India, if they had any lived experience. I personally think at Give, the way we think about it is we need to solve for trust, discovery, and scale. Because if you don't solve for that, you can package it to a donor based on their journey. You know, some people may need more of a curation and a cultivation. Some people may just need, might be at an early stage where they just need more of that learning and curiosity generation. So we can package it to the stage of the donor. But I think if we don't solve for trust in organizations, if we don't, I mean, discovery, like we need to know all the anubhutis that are in India. I think discovery is the key, especially if you're here. You hear of 10, 15, 20 organizations, but there are so many small and medium-sized organizations that have the right interventions, that have the ability to scale, but lack the fundraising muscle to be in front of a US donor. So how do we make discovery easy and also scale? People here, especially in the Bay Area, are motivated by scale. They think of how do I solve this problem and how do I solve it at scale? So, trust, discovery, and scale. And to answer your question directly, I think people who are getting in, how do we create these pathways where we meet them where they are in their journey? So if they just have an interest, how do we create, like the essay competition, how do we start early? How do we create that learning environment, that initial curiosity around giving to India and the ecosystem in India?
And maybe also just to add that I think it's really important to build it around sort of a learning mindset as opposed to a savior mindset, right? Because that's the risk that we can run sometimes. And so I think just having to focus on learning and exposure and saying, look, just be embedded in some of these communities. Just understand how they live as human beings, as you would with any other human being, is a really nice way of actually setting the ground rules for then a more shared engagement, as opposed to one in which some of the power dynamics we've been speaking about can get easily exacerbated.
I just build on what Ashish said, right? At least for my kids or for my network, right? I'm not as concerned whether they give or whether they are very involved with giving in India, etc. Like I just want them to be global citizens. So I'd be really happy even if they are super involved with organizations and causes in the US or in their neighborhood or in their colleges, right? But I think building the social muscle, right, building that empathy gene in them, like getting them to think about what others, like trying to get them to walk in other people's shoes a bit more. To me, that's more important than. And I think later on in time, hopefully, they may or may not ever go back to India, right? But that's totally okay for me.
Hi, my name is Bhavik from MSI Charitable Trust, and thank you so much for putting this session together. This question is specifically for Lobo, and I'm curious to understand, so in recent trends, a lot of open AI technology, I mean, open AI of course, but like a lot of open AI focused nonprofits first raise a bunch of funding, and then as soon as they get traction, they have an offshoot, which is for profit, and then they transfer the IP rights, etc. So how does your foundation, has it come across such case studies? How do they navigate it? And for future, possibilities where people reach out, what would you advise to family offices, etc., in order to guard themselves from such an event?
Yeah, I mean, son, this is a whole different conversation, and I could spend hours on it, right? With regard to open source licenses and etc. But the nice thing about open source or licenses, right? So two things, right? First is, I don't think there's anything wrong with someone starting up a for-profit to sustain the non-profit, right? Depending on the ethics, morals, principles of the founders. Actually, Tech for Dev very recently incorporated a for-profit, right? Because we want to be sustainable, and I think tech companies should be sustainable. But the nice thing about open source is when people decide to close source and move their stuff and IP to a for-profit company, they really cannot move their stuff and IP to a for-profit company. Because what you've done and what you've funded as open source today, right, remains as is with that license now and forevermore. You just can't change the license on something existing. You can change it for the future, but what you've already done stays as is for now and forevermore, right? So that really prevents it. The second thing that we, again, like many of the times, the way we've started off was we allowed NGOs to make the decision and everything, and then I realized like recommendations sometimes don't work. So pretty much today, any of the funds that we give, especially for technology, our rule is if it's not open source, if you haven't made it open source before, we are not going to fund it, period, right? When you make it open source, then give us a call and talk to us. But don't tell me that we will make it open source when it's ready or we will release it to the world when it's ready, because I know and you know you'll never be ready and it's not going to happen. I know this has happened to me multiple times, right? And so now it's like, first put it out there, give me the link to it, and then again, it means like I have had emails saying like, oh, our stuff is open source, and my next email is like, send me the link. So far, out of those approximately 10 emails, only one person sent me the link. Right. So again, like it's really easy for, and I don't think they're doing it. Means most NGOs really don't know anything about open source to do it. But I think from an intention perspective, they mean well. But from an execution perspective or from a sharing perspective, it does not mean anything. Right. It's actually quite useless. Sorry.
We have time for one more question. So.
Hi, this is Shruti Diora, India Energy and Climate Center, UC Berkeley. So I have a question for the panel, anybody, but basically climate giving currently is a very small portion of global philanthropy, and climate change is, promises to be a huge challenge for India, so much so that it might nullify gains on other sectors that we see. So my question is there an upcoming interest from philanthropic circles in terms of giving on climate change issues for India, and if yes, what's the approach? What's the approach that philanthropists are taking? Thank you.
So I think there is, Shruti, I think there is interest. You see a lot of activity where there are funds being created, collaboratives being created. I think people are, it's clear that it is the defining issue of our time. It has intersectionality with health, livelihoods, income. If we don't solve for climate, this is, it is going to be it's going to be a problem. In terms of philanthropy capital, I've seen a lot of adaptation adjacent work being put in front of philanthropists. So things around reforestation, livelihoods, anything that impacts communities. Uh, yeah, so I think it is happening. I think there is a lot of interest, and in the next few months and years, you will see several organizations, several philanthropists focused on this. At least we at GIVE are also working on adaptation adjacent funds. So, and I know several others are. So there is going to be a lot of interest.
And I think also, for us, it's something that we're just trying to learn. Because I think beforehand, this is something that my thinking on has really evolved. I think before I always thought that, oh, I'm going to focus on marginalization first, and climate can wait. And over time, I've just gotten a much deeper understanding that no, climate change really affects the most marginalized disproportionately. And so you have to bring that lens in. I mean, we were talking with Deep yesterday, who works in the Northeast. He's working in land that's going to be affected. Deepa's work, I mean, these are real things that are going to affect communities that are the most vulnerable and are the least likely to be resilient to these kinds of changes. So it's an area where I think, for me, I'm still very much learning and very interested to learn, and that's why I'm excited about the session this afternoon. Because I think that is really a way for me to understand also, what does it mean for us to bring that kind of lens into the existing work that we do in a way that we haven't done before.
Yeah. I just wanted to, that's absolutely true. I think the more you learn and research, the more you find out that there's so much that you just don't know. Like people talk about reforestation, climate smart agriculture. We just realized quickly in 3 months that we just lack the depth. We are no climate experts. We are good at fundraising, we are good at donor management, but when it comes to climate, we don't know anything. And we were talking about tree plantation. There are so many things just in tree plantation. If you don't plant with purpose, the whole the purpose is defeated. And so just the last 3 or 4 months has been just an eye opener that this is going to be a long slog, but we need to get started.
Thank you so much. And before we close out and go on to the next session for the day, just a quick observation that we've had through the Rebuild India Fund around climate is that we are very excited to find donors look at climate as an intersectionality, as a horizontal, because exactly like Ria said, marginalization happens also because of climate. So for example, the Rebuild India Fund has around 30% or more of its NGOs that work on climate as one of the issues. And it'll be interesting to see funders also come up and realize that it might not be a one-off, but something that's a part of all of their programs. So yeah, just closing thoughts on that, but thank you very much everyone for being so patient, so nice, and thank you to our panelists for taking the time.